Alrighty, guys, welcome everyone. Love it. I'm Adam Costanzo. I'm a member of the history faculty here at TAMU-CC. The idea behind the historical forum, which this event is that it should not just be another guest speaker brought in to give their latest historical thoughts to the rest of the history faculty and some of our students, but an event where we bring the whole community in to hear historians from around the country. Today's historical forum event, I think, does that really well, blends some work on history with some deep community connection here in Corpus Christi. Our talk today and our guests today are going to tell us all about the Karankawa tribe, its history, past and present. We have with us today Dr. Tim Seiter from the University of Texas, Tyler. Tim is a scholar of the Karankawa. He's currently authoring a book about the Karankawa tribe. We also have two representatives from the tribe itself. We have Cari, Villarreal, Varner, and Chiara, Beaumont with us today to share the perspective of the tribe on their past, present, and future here in Corpus. A couple of things to get out of the way first. We bring in some more here for our overflow crowd. Before we start anything else, I wanted to take a moment to offer a brief memoriam for Dr. Robert Ball, who passed away this Sunday. Bob was the founder and the primary funder of this event. He was a doctor, but he was not the PhD sort of doctor that, like me and some of the other faculty types in here. He was a doctor, a cardiologist, in fact. He was trained at and worked at some of the finest medical schools in the country before coming and establishing a practice in Corpus Christi in 1989, where he spent about 30 years in private practice as a cardiologist here. And Bob loved history, and that's why he wanted to create the historical forum and to offer the opportunity for us to have these events. And so it's very sad that he passed away before this final event this week, but we definitely have Bob in our hearts moving forward. Also, before we turn things over to our panelists, I wanted to read out the land acknowledgement from the that's been passed by the Academic Senate here at the university. Earlier today, Cari shared with me a land acknowledgement text that the tribe has worked up, and we've got copies of that. And that might become a topic that we talk about later. But the universities states that Texas A&M University-Corpus Christi Faculty Senate recognizes the enduring relationship between the indigenous peoples and their ancestral lands and waters. And the university occupies the sacred lands of the Karankawa, Laipunapatchi, Comanche, Tonkawa, Coquille-Tecan, and other tribal and detribalized peoples who have lived along the Nueces River from before recorded history to the present day. TAMU-CC must respect the rights of these people by engaging in ethical practices and sustaining collaborative relationships with their communities. We encourage all to engage honestly with our shared past as we work toward justice and collective healing amid the ongoing traumas and erasures caused by colonialism. This land acknowledgement serves as a promise of our commitment to these communities and the resources they steward. So, our plan for today is to invite Tim to speak first and tell us a little bit about his research and the long past of the Karankawa, and then turn it over to Cari and Chiara to tell us a little bit about the present day perspective. And after that, we'll open up to questions from the room, which I will have a nice spot. Thanks very much.
Thank you so much for that lovely introduction, Adam. And then again, thank you to everyone here in the audience for coming out today and listening to us speak. And of course, we need to thank Sunshine and Cari for being here as well. I really appreciate that. So today I'll be speaking about the revitalization of the Karankawa peoples of the Texas Gulf Coast. For the past around 150 years, scholars and academics have labeled these people as extinct, as inert, that they just disappeared, walked off into the sunset. But now you have dozens of individuals that are coming forward and proclaiming they are of Karankawa descent. And this isn't just happening here on the Texas Gulf Coast, it's happening all across the America, all across Texas. We see this with the Colotecan people here in South Texas. We see this with the Attakapaw people in the Louisiana, Texas border. It's happening all across the United States. Native cultures that are long thought dead are emerging and being regrown. So my goal today is to explore why most people believe the Karankawas were extinct. And then I'll discuss how they survived and how they continue to thrive today. Ultimately, our roadmap, I'm going to be giving maybe like around a 30-minute talk, and then we'll turn things over to the panel. So if you have any questions, you can kind of direct them to the panel. And then for the panel, because I'll be speaking for the next 30 or so minutes, I'm going to try to take a little bit of a back seat. So I'm hoping you can kind of direct more of your questions to some of the Karankawa tribal members. Okay. So now here in Corpus Christi, most of us probably immediately recognize the name Karankawa. We know who the Karankawas were, where they lived, but for those of us that are not native to this area, I think it's important that I provide a little bit of context and background as to who the Karankawa peoples were. So the Karankawa peoples are a cultural group, and they consisted of multiple different tribes, 5 tribes historically. Now, when I called the people the Karankawas, it's important to point out that all these different tribes, they shared the same language, they shared a similar culture, but they were not a unified people. Like we see them finally begin to unify in the late 1700s to fend off a genocidal attack by the Spanish, but for most of their existence, they were kind of more autonomous, and we even see certain Native American or certain Karankawa tribes going to war against each other. And so we use that term Karankawas as a way of just generalizing these people. Because if I had to describe every single tribe, it would end up just confusing us all. So historically, the Karankawas lived from around Galveston Bay all the way down to Corpus Christi Bay. And the reason why we know very accurately these territorial boundaries is because of this Rockport pottery. And now I'm kicking myself. I actually had some replica Rockport pottery I was going to pass around to everyone, but it's currently in my car. So after the presentation, I'll open my trunk, you can check out the pottery. I will say that this pottery, I had a student actually try to recreate this. It's incredibly, incredibly difficult to craft this in the method they actually use. And she tried for months to create replicas, and it was barely a success. So the Karankawas creating this pottery really, really talented. In terms of defining their territorial borders, we use this pottery because the Karankawa peoples were the only people or culture that created Rockport-type pottery. And so this pottery is unique from other types of pottery like Goose Creek pottery because of the naturally occurring tar called asphaltum that they use to waterproof it and also to add designs to the ceramics. And so what you need to do as an archaeologist to determine the boundaries of the Karankawas is you simply go look for this pottery out in the field. And whenever you see heavy concentrations of this pottery at like a campsite, you know then that was a Karankawa territory, it's Karankawa domain. And by doing so, we know that the Karankawas ranged from around the Galveston area down to Corpus Christi and ranged inland 30 or so miles. What's important to point out, though, is that that's the archaeological range, only where we find this pottery. But historically, we see the Karankawas' domain, their territory, change over time. It was very dynamic, but wasn't static. In fact, beginning in the late 1700s, we see the Karankawas begin to move further into Galveston and incorporate more of that territory into their own. And that's because the Karankawas were powerful, and a lot of other native groups were kind of being decimated by disease and other ecological factors. The Karankawas kind of took that land over. The Karankawa peoples lived a semi-sedentary life. During the spring and the summer, they would go into the interior of Texas, where they would try to hunt big game like bison and deer. And so I always wondered, how are these Karankawa peoples who don't have access to horses yet or guns, they only have bows and arrows, how are they killing these bison? How are they killing them in great numbers? Well, there is a geologist down in Houston named Dan Worrell who figured it out. He actually found the archaeological sites where the Karankawas would kill bison for thousands of years, quite literally thousands of years. And what they would do is run these bison over cliffs. Now, y'all have probably heard of these buffaloes being run off of cliffs in the Southwest. We don't typically encounter that here on the Texas Gulf Coast, but it certainly happened. So what the Karankawas would do, because they're so savvy, is they would get behind the buffalo, they would set fire to the grasslands and try to drive and force these bison over creek and river beds. And if you've ever seen the San Antonio River, like that's not actually San Antonio, the banks are incredibly steep. And so these bison that are just afraid of the fire end up running over those banks, falling into the water, breaking a leg, and the Karankawas are there to wait and kill them and harvest their bodies. And again, they do that for thousands of years. That is during the summer and the spring. During the winter and the fall, the Karankawas moved back to their coastline in their permanent or semi-permanent settlements, because they did have towns. Now, you likely grew up learning about the Karankawas as being a nomadic people, and they wander to and fro in search of food. That's not accurate. That's actually propaganda that was created by the Spanish and later Anglo-Americans. The Karankawas did, in fact, have settlements, like this one here at McGlowan's Bluff on the east side of Corpus Christi Bay. So they would come to these settlements, and these towns consisted over around 500 people. And in these towns, they would do their ceremonial practices. They would trade with other different Karankawa tribes. They would intermarry with other different Karankawa clans. And then also they would harvest what ends up being what another scholar termed their staff of life. Now, for any of y'all that are foodies, and particularly like oysters, you know that oysters are at their peak, they're at their best during the winter. The Karankawas knew that too, so they would come to these areas right where we're standing right now and harvest oysters the entire winter, and also hunt and bowfish, redfish, and what have you. So this is, as I mentioned, a Karankawa settlement, McGlowan's Bluff. It is around 5 football fields in length, and it was inhabited from the 1300s all the way up to the 1700s for a long period of time. And archaeologists, when they discovered this site, actually uncovered 40,000 different Karankawa artifacts. And there are likely many more buried under the sand on the east side of this location. But a lot of energy companies, various energy companies, have threatened this ancient settlement. And so the Karankawa tribe of Texas has really done a great job in fighting against energy companies expanding into these territories and trying to protect this settlement. The next topic I wanted to talk about is how the Karankawas should be remembered. And the way I like to put it is that the Karankawas were the jewelers of Texas. The jewelers of Texas. And that's because whenever they'd be walking down the beach, they would locate very beautiful shells and create jewelry out of it. One of the most popular shells that they would use, or snails, I should say, is the lightning whelk, which is the state shell of Texas. Now, these lightning whelk, they would turn them into pendants, and these pendants were so valuable that geologist in Houston named Dan Worrell located these types of pendants all the way up in the Great Lakes, which shows how deeply ingrained and how long Indian trade pathways were. Now, I'm sure many of us in this room have heard of the Camino Royal, the Royal Road, the Spanish Royal Road. That is just a name the Spaniards put onto a trade path that was already there. These native peoples have been having very extensive trade networks far longer than the Spanish ever, since they entered the Americas. And so the Karankawas, what they would do is they would create these jewelries during the winter when they're living in their permanent settlements. And when they moved into the inland, they would trade their jewelry with these inland groups that would also help them hunt the bison. And again, we find this jewelry very, very far away. And then the last thing I needed to discuss is just how much the Karankawas were truly masters of their environment. Now, y'all have likely heard this myth that the Karankawas were giants, and I actually might come back to it later on in this presentation. The reason why the Karankawas seemed like giants is because the average height of a European when they first encountered the Karankawas ranged from 5'2" to around 5'4". So the Karankawas, they knew how to live in their environment, and they harvested all sorts of different types of foods. We find over 300 different types of animal remains in their actual trash heaps, these archaeological trash heaps. And because they ate so well, because they ate so frequently, they ended up being much healthier than a lot of other Native American groups in the region. And because of that healthiness, they ended up being much taller than other Native American groups in the region. That did not mean that they were 8 or 9 foot tall giants. They were actually the average height of an American today, which was incredibly tall for the time period. Excellent, so that's our quick context. That's our background. Now we're gonna kind of move into this idea of the revitalization. So I have pictured here a Karankawa descendant known as Enrique Gonzalez, and he has been kind enough to actually join us today. He is right here. So Enrique was incredibly brave, and in 2009, he proclaimed that he was one of the last living Karankawa peoples. And the Brownsville Herald picked up on this story and wanted to interview him. And in that interview, they also interviewed a college professor at the University of Texas at Brownsville. That college professor did not believe Enrique Gonzalez could be related to the Karankawa peoples. And I have the direct quote right here. That professor said, "To say that he believes he's descended from Native American groups in the area is plausible, but to say that they are the Karankawas is a stretch. And I don't believe it, and I don't think he can prove it." Funnily enough, Enrique Gonzalez just handed me a big vanilla folder that proves that he's Karankawa. So this academic is extremely skeptical of Enrique's claims, and that's likely because all the historical literature that's ever been written on the Karankawas up until recently has labeled them as an extinct, disappeared people. So when he's referring to this literature, he sees that they're extinct, so he doesn't think that Enrique could potentially be a Karankawa. We're going to show that's not really the case, and in fact, the Karankawas will persevere throughout a genocide and many other types of efforts to remove them from their land. So the question is, why do all these academics in 2009 believe the Karankawas are extinct? Again, I already said once, the literature, and then the second reason is because the Karankawas were an incredibly powerful people, a very powerful people. So from the 1200s all the way up until the 1820s, 1830s, the Karankawa peoples maintained firm control over the Texas coastline. Now that's a period of around 500 years. By comparison, the United States is only around 250 years old. And some people think that might be the end of it soon. So the Karankawa people have been together and strong for literally twice as long as the United States has been a nation. And with that power, they did all sorts of different things. The very first thing I like to bring up is that they actually exacted tribute, or I should say protection payments, from the Spanish. When we think about the Spanish coming into Texas or colonizing California, we think of them forcing Native peoples to build missions, and in these missions, they end up dying out of disease. They're forced to be there. They're taught to lose control of, they can't talk their own language and what have you. That certainly happened all across the Americas. But among the Karankawas, it occurred in a little bit different way. There are, yes, certainly some Karankawas that go to San Antonio that live in these stereotypical missions, but on the Texas Gulf Coast, it operated differently. The Karankawas are thriving, even after Europeans come to their land. The Spaniards, however, when they try to live in Texas, are having a very, very bad time of it. In fact, we see the Spaniards are dying of scurvy at this time. So things are really, really tough for them, and the Karankawas take advantage of that. They, like the Spaniards, are building on their land because they're not afraid of missions or these big stone forts. They'll just go around those forts if they need to. What they like about the Europeans, though, are these new goods they're bringing into their communities. The Karankawas, as being the jewelers of Texas, know all about trade. And they know that these items are things that they've never seen before and are really good for trading. So they use their power to force the Spaniards, in many regards, to give them these items. And so they'll come into missions, acquire free goods, and then they'll go back to their coastline and be protected. And this very much infuriates the Spanish to no end. They are very, very upset with that. The Karankawas also are able to police their shoreline. As my anglers know, these bays out here in Corpus, they look deep, but in reality, they're not. They can go up to really your shin at different points. The Spanish and European sailors, they didn't know that. And so we see the Karankawas actually trying to lure in vessels, Spanish ships, into these bays so they'll be grounded and wrecked. And then the Karankawas will raid these vessels and acquire alcohol, guns, gunpowder, and at certain points in their history, they had more weapons than the Spanish. So the dynamic here is much different than what you've likely been taught in the past. These are a powerful, powerful people. And again, all the way up until the 1820s, 1830s, they maintained that power. But then come Anglo-Americans. On July 26, 1821, Stephen F. Austin crosses the Sabine River and he starts to tour lands that were granted to him by the Mexican government. And these lands are in the heartland of the Karankawa people. It's the Karankawa country. The issue is that Austin, he's doing his research, obviously, to colonize this new land. But when he's doing his research, he's looking at all the different accounts of the Karankawas that the Spanish made. Because the Spanish knew the Karankawas best or interacted with the Karankawas best. And because the Karankawas made the Spaniards pay them protection payments, the Spanish had to come up with an excuse to tell their superiors where all their goods are going. And so their excuse is not that they are weaker than these native peoples. Their excuse is that these native peoples are just savage, you cannot live alongside them, that you cannot, that they're always looking to attack and kill. And that wasn't true. That wasn't true. That's just what they ended up making up to justify why they were not successful. So Stephen F. Austin has been reading this. And whenever he enters Texas for the first time, this is what he says. The Karankawas may be called the universal enemies to man. They kill all nations that come into their power, and there will be no way of subduing them but extermination. The ironic thing about this is that Austin has this imagery of what the Karankawas are supposed to be like. But on this trip, he encounters some Karankawa people. He just doesn't know because he's very ignorant. He encounters a group of Karankawas, called the Cocos, the Coco people. And when he encounters them, he goes back to his campsite later that night and talks about how wonderful they are, how friendly they are, how they showed him where's a good place to live, who are people you need to avoid. He had no idea that he was talking about the Karankawas because he didn't understand they had many different tribes and because their imagery had been so propagandized by the Spanish. Now I'm going to go into some of these myths and quickly debunk them because I'm sure everyone here in this audience has heard at least one myth about the Karankawas. The first myth I'm going to debunk is this idea that they smell very, very bad. So this myth actually has a bit of truth, a kernel of truth. So on the Texas coastline, there are two constants that are, in many regards, hellish. Those are the burning sun and the mosquitoes. And so the Karankawas dealt with the burning sun by building these permanent shelters out of bison hides and deer hides. When it came to the mosquitoes, they would build great fires with a lot of smoke to ward the mosquitoes off. But when you're traveling, you can't always just keep a fire next to you. So they were ingenious, and what they would do is that they would go kill some bears or acquire some fish and rub that bear fat or also alligator grease and even cod grease on their skin, and it effectively wards off mosquitoes. And the reason why we know this is because of this wonderful anthropologist out of Rice who built a box, filled it with mosquitoes, rubbed some bear fat on the skin, and stuck his arm in there. And it turned out that it is an incredibly effective mosquito repellent. The downside is that it smells not all that great. So this kind of myth of the bad-smelling Karankawas has often been attributed to their lack of hygiene. That's also something that is incorrect. The Karankawas are considered to be one of the most hygienic people of Texas. I'm not just over-exaggerating here. This is actually have the quote up. Yes. The Karankawas had this cultural belief that they needed to bathe themselves every single morning in a local river or body of water. Even when the ice covered that body of water, they would break it and bathe themselves. They were not a smelly, dirty people. They were just masters of their environment. Another common myth is that they were incredibly aggressive to newcomers, to Europeans. I've already debunked that for you in this presentation. They were people of trade. They were familiar with a very diverse Texas. In fact, I want you to think about how many groups, native groups, lived in Texas. Right now, just think about a number in your head. How many native groups lived in Texas? Now, you might be thinking around 10 to 50. In actuality, 300 unique native peoples lived in Texas. And 300, of those 300, most of them spoke different languages. And so a lot of academics believe that Indian Sign Language was developed here in Texas as a language of trade. And so the Karankawas were not at all worried to see alien-looking people or newcomers. That's what they're used to dealing with on a regular basis. When we look at the very first contacts with the Karankawas and colonizers, they're often incredibly, incredibly friendly. The Karankawas will actually save some shipwrecked conquistadors in 1528. The Karankawas, when they meet La Salle for the first time, who's this French explorer, they'll rub their hand over their heart as a sign of friendship. Both of these ventures will end up going sour when the colonizers do actions the Karankawas are attacking their people, attacking their community. I'm going to skip the giant myth. That's obviously very easy to debunk. Back in the past, a lot of the archaeologists didn't have the same, what is the word I'm looking for? They would very much dig up native remains and store them in university archives. And that nowadays is certainly frowned upon, especially if you're not including these indigenous peoples. But because of that, we're able to actually measure these remains of Karankawa people. And we know by measuring these remains, they were not that. They were as tall as the average American. They were not giants. And then the last thing I want to touch on is a very touchy subject. And it's something that not everyone agrees to. And I'm not going to say that my perception is more correct than anyone else's. But that last subject I want to touch on is cannibalism. You'll all have likely heard of the Karankawas cannibalism. Before I kind of dive into that, I need to say that if we're looking at cultures that practice anthropophagy or cannibalism incredibly regularly, we need to look into our own culture if you're European, because the Europeans at the time regularly practiced the consuming of human flesh. What they would do is if you were sick, for instance, if you had a bruise on your arm, you would go to the apothecary, you would acquire human fat, and you would eat that fat, and it's believed that it would cure your bruise. If you have a migraine, you would grind up some human skulls, you would drink that human skull remains, and then it would cure your headache, or so the reasoning went. And so cannibalism is far more common than we tend to believe. The difference is that the Europeans labeled this as medicine, as scientific, and because of that, it wasn't seen as barbaric. In Texas, and again, my views are not reflective of many other native peoples that have studied this, but in Texas, I do think there is evidence that cannibalism was practiced, but it was incredibly, incredibly specific, and it was done only in a very specific manner that was very much exaggerated, over-exaggerated by colonizers. I can get more into that practice during the Q&A, but it's really important to point out that colonizers will use this supposed cannibalism to justify later annihilations and genocides against this people. All right, so Stephen F. Austin just came into Texas. He's beginning to build his settlement of the old 300, and he's nervous about the Karankawa peoples. And so he decides to put together a paramilitary group that we have all heard of before, the Texas Rangers. And so the Texas Rangers, their whole goal, their origin, is truly to hunt down and kill Karankawa peoples. If you go to a Texas Ranger museum, they're likely going to tell you the origin point was the Texas Rangers were created to stop the Comanche menace to protect the settlers, and that's certainly true to an extent, but the true origin has to do with the Karankawas. And I do not want to discount some of the good things the Texas Rangers have done. Like during these oil boom towns in Texas, they were truly the only law in these settlements. When it comes to their origins, they were founded to kill and exterminate these evil Karankawa peoples. And they are, in many regards, successful in that attempt to try to kill as many Karankawas as possible. And so the question is, why? Why are they so successful? For really the past, as soon as the Karankawas encountered Europeans, they were continually being dominant. But things have changed by the 1800s. Disease, wave after wave of disease has really decimated this tribe. Also, they're having other Native American groups that are trying to acquire their territory. So they're fighting with these other Native American groups. There's also infighting among different settlers and what have you. And so the Karankawas at this point are really losing their power. And the biggest reason, in my eyes, is that they're becoming incredibly outnumbered. So between the 1820s and the 1830s, more than 30,000 Anglo and Euro-Americans entered Texas. And the Karankawas at that time, we believe the population was only around maybe 800, potentially likely a little bit lower. So that was the 1820s, 1830s, around 30,000 newcomers. By the 1840s, Texas had an Anglo-American population of 100,000. And the Karankawas had a population at that point of only a few hundred souls. So power had completely flipped by that point. And during that time, we see the settlers begin to purposely label the Karankawas as extinct. And this is done purposely because if the Karankawas are extinct, they can't come back and reclaim land that is rightfully theirs. And this land nowadays is worth quite literally billions upon billions of dollars. So I told the story of Enrique and Gonzalez a little bit earlier, and whenever Enrique and Gonzalez came forward, they didn't believe him, and they didn't believe him because of what was spread during the 1850s. They believed that the Karankawas had just disappeared, but they had not disappeared. The Karankawas are a persistent, adaptable people. They continue to find ways to survive. The very first way that we see most Karankawas survive is by being forcibly assimilated into the settlers' society. A really good example that is quite morbid comes around the 1840s. I think 1845. You have a posse of Anglo-Americans near the Goliad area that locate a Karankawa campsite. They surround the entirety of the Karankawa campsite and kill as many Karankawas as they can, men, women, children. Of that massacre, there's only three survivors. A mother and her two children. She has a daughter and she has a son. She walks into Goliad with her children and she begs the colonizers to take them and raise them. Otherwise, she's afraid these children are going to be killed. And in fact, I believe, and please correct me if I'm wrong here, and you actually looked at the primary source, I believe they actually ended up murdering the mother.
No, one became a soldier, boy.
So exactly. So these two children
And
are
daughter died childless in like
the Pavlovs, Mary Pavlov.
Yeah.
Exactly.
she's buried up there.
in Beeville, Texas. So if you ever want to see her actual grave, it's in Beeville, Texas. So the mother, she gives her two children up to be power welder family, as was mentioned, very well researched. And the son ends up going to fight in the Confederacy. He dies during that fight in the Confederacy. The daughter, who is renamed Mary, and she has different types of last names, Mary Patoff, Mary Amber, I think at one point. She marries someone that also fights in the Civil War and perishes. She'll die childless and be born. You can actually see her grave there. And a lot of people view these as the last Karankawas. So that's one way some Karankawa people were able to survive. They're integrated into the settlers' society. Another way they're able to survive is that we see them integrate into other Native American tribes. In the late 1800s, the United States has officially won the West away from Native peoples. And so they begin to send out ethnologists or anthropologists to many different Native peoples. That way their language isn't lost. They don't fully disappear. When we see these ethnologists go to groups like the Tonkawas and the Apaches, we see that some members of their societies speak the Karankawa language. So it shows further evidence that they have assimilated some members of the Karankawa group, or some of these groups were officially, originally part of the Karankawa tribe. The third way they were able to survive was moving south and leaving Texas entirely. Texas was viewed as an incredibly hostile place, and so they decided to move south out of Texas and try to integrate themselves into Mexican society or the lower border Tejano society. But in these instances, they had to hide who they were, hide their identity. Because even today, that term Indio carries a very negative connotation. And we also see with these survivors that many end up being women. And the reason is that women were more easily accepted into the colonizer's society. Men were viewed much more as a threat. There is an instance, and we have a surviving man who ends up carrying mail between different settlements, but I'm kind of going over on time, so I'm going to stick to the script. So instead of being extinct, the Karankawa peoples were passing down aspects of their culture generation after generation. I gave a talk with Chiara maybe like a year and a half ago, and she describes it best. She describes the Karankawa tribe as one of pieces, a tribe of pieces, that they're only able to hold on to pieces of their stories, their spiritualities, and even some of their sports. And throughout the 1900s to the present day, you begin to have, like Enrique Gonzalez, other people coming forward and proclaiming to be Karankawa themselves. They have gathered together and have formed the Karankawa tribe of Texas. Now, usually when someone says they are Karankawa, they receive this answer. How can you prove it? How can you prove that you are a Karankawa person? And that is a very, very tricky question to answer. For people that are actually of Karankawa descent, it's something they have grown with and lived with your entire life. And it's like, oh, why are you questioning my identity? But when it comes to finding the actual records from the supposed extinction point to the present, things get complicated because the Karankawas were such a prime target of attack. So one, DNA tests. They say, look at DNA tests. The thing about DNA tests is that they're not as reliable as you would think. They're incredibly problematic at times because the genetic DNA markers of native peoples are not as thorough as they should be. If you remember earlier in my lecture, I mentioned how diverse Texas was. So imagine 300 different unique people. You need all those genetic markers to accurately pinpoint where someone's at. So DNA testing can potentially tell you if you have what we think is indigenous blood. It can also potentially pinpoint where you may be from, but it's not the be-all, end-all. The second thing you can do is look at your ancestry, do genetic research. When it comes to the Karankawas, it's not like these colonists, when they were committing genocide against the Karankawa people, were recording the names of those they killed. You know, the Karankawas are trying to hide their identity, so they don't want it to be known. And typically, the native peoples in San Antonio, they are fortunate that they have the baptismal and burial records of their ancestors. Down in Goliad, there are 3 different missions, and these 3 different missions certainly have burial and baptismal records. We don't know where they're at. We haven't located them. I spoke with a phenomenal historian known as Frank de la Teja, and we believe that those records might have been taken away during the 1810 revolution, the Mexican Revolution, or they might have been burned accidentally. That happened much more frequently. So tracing your ancestry, if you're from that Goliad area as a Karankawa, is nearly impossible. And so what I've been doing in my own research has been relying on oral histories. I interview Karankawa descendants, I try to learn about their past, and I use an oral history as a jumping off point to do more research. And by using that approach, you're able to, in many instances, connect families from the supposed disappearance to the present. And again, we have a direct example with us today. Enrique Gonzalez quite literally has his papers to prove that he was here, and he was able to remember this because of these oral histories that I believe your father was able to pass down. He actually experienced participating in one of the Karankawa cultural dances. Okay, so ultimately this idea of the disappearing Karankawas is not true. The Karankawas were able to survive, and a large number of individuals, as I said, have stepped for and proclaim themselves as Karankawa descendants. And together they have revitalized the language, they have re-examined and corrected numerous falsified accounts of the people, and they have protested oil companies that are building atop their land. So that's all I have for now. Thank you so much. I'm going to turn it over to Anna.
Doctor, just quickly, you had Texas Monthly, you had a sentence, Texas Monthly, what is that?
Oh.
There it is.
Here we go.
What is that?
The Chronicle wants you to know they're not.
That is a Texas Monthly article that was the cover story and the cover page in August.
And you two ladies are on that cover?
Yes, ma'am.
Oh.
And another sibling, another gentleman. Does my voice carry? Can you guys hear?
Any questions?
Yes. For that particular one, somebody reached out to us to ask if we were willing to be interviewed, and so they reached out to Sunshine actually through her Instagram, and then we were delegated from the council, the two people, to go and meet with the author, the writer, and vet him and see if we trusted. And so across maybe the better part of a year, he joined us at a few things, and he interviewed different things he observed, and he wrote an article. We did not know at the time that it was going to be the cover story. We met the photographer, gosh, that was maybe 6-7 months after we met the author, right? Her name is Andrea Mendoza. She took our pictures. We had no idea, again, that it was going to be selected as that particular issue's feature.
So I personally don't know much about the process of indigenous record keeping in like from the American standpoint of who is a tribe and who isn't a tribe, who is extinct, who isn't extinct. But could you talk about your experience in like joining into the momentum of fighting for these lands and realizing that you wanted to put your identity forth in a much more like assertive, stronger way to fight for your, I guess, culture and identity?
Did everybody hear that question? So, as it pertains to our tribe, I always like to start off by saying that it is a very unique experience. I begin with everything by saying there's no such thing as Native American culture. That's a myth, because every single tribe has their own very separate and distinct culture. And even as I speak from my experience, it can't even, as Tim was saying, be technically Karankawa, but here's the familial lineage Hoh'k clan experience. So, lucky me, I was always raised on Karankawa, but we didn't know where everybody else was at. What we did have, though, and this was before internet access in homes, was what textbooks were telling us. And every single textbook was saying that we were extinct. And if you can imagine what that feels like, think about yourself and your heritage right now. What would you call yourself? American, Mexican, Danish? Imagine they're dead. It's just you. And for most of my adolescence, that was okay. I had my immediate family, we were Karankawa, and that was fine. But then, when the internet got into our home, one of the first things that all Karankawa people did was look up, where are you all at? And I remember when Facebook was getting really popular, we found a Facebook, my mom found a Facebook page of the other Karankawas were doing the exact same thing. Hey, I'm Karankawa, where are you? And we had a video call, we all cried, and we all realized, wow, well, if this is happening here and now with just a few of us, imagine how many more there must be, and how lonely we had felt for so long, how traumatized we were, and most importantly, how wonderful it was to see all of each other again. In that spiritual way, again, we never met these people really in person. And so, that was unanimous. that was a very natural, I would even argue spiritual way that we're just, okay, got it. We're still here for the rest of our lives. This is going to be our thing. We're going to find the rest of our people. We're going to gather. We're going to share the pieces of culture that we were able to keep. Can you share the pieces of culture that you were able to keep? They said yes. Then it just kept growing and growing. Eventually, conversations of what we need to defend came up, e.g. the coast and bridge. And yeah, so it was a very natural momentum that came just to save us and do good by what had happened to us as well.
Yeah, it was very, very, very organic and right into very, very organic, and also there were so many shared experiences that were nearly identical, right? And we have people that are from along the coast whose families are still here. There's some people that are still here, and I wanted to first say that our sister Love Sanchez, who is here local, also Hoh'k fan, was not able to come because of the family emergency, but we do absolutely give all the credit to her for all of the environmental work that is being done in this area. But those shared experiences, regardless of where you were along the coast, and then for some people that have left, whose families have left the coast and are now we got people in California, we got people in Ohio, we got people in Chicago, Illinois, we got people, just in New York, and still similar, very almost identical experiences. And we're like, oh my gosh, this is why that spiritual connection. So organically what happened was we finally said, there's enough of a strength in numbers, right? Let's do something about the annihilation that is happening and the rape and pillaging that is happening of these lands, because land is sacred, water is sacred, and these people who just care about the almighty dollar, who already have enough, are wanting to destroy even more. It's just not right. So it's kind of like, okay, do you want to put a target on yourself and be vocal about it? Yeah, I'm okay with that, right?
So how do you ascertain if you are a true Karankawa? How do you trace back? Give us an example for yourself.
Correct.
And then I heard the aspect of clan. As I explained, the Karankawa is for a people.
Correct.
And it sounds like you have a subset of clans. So how do you vet people to ascertain that they are true Karankawas?
Good question, absolutely. The question was, how do you vet people? How do you know you're true Karankawa? So I can tell you for myself, but I'm also going to tell you about my sister Love, who does have Goliath record proof of her family lineage. I don't have that. For me, it was oral history, as well as I did do the DNA thing. The DNA thing tells me, besides what my mother told me when we passed by Karankawa Street all the time, these are our people.
Which is a C instead of a K.
Correct, yeah.
Right.
My name is Chiara with a C, my grandmother, German, is it with a K? But the lettering really doesn't bother me. But, and the result, as Tim mentioned, so we know where the Karankawas were in what time frame along the coast. When my DNA comes back to be in this area along the coast, I don't need the substantiation beyond what I've been told orally and what that showed me. I feel it. I can't explain it to you. I know that it's Karankawa and not Lipanapache and not, Coahuitecan or whatever. I feel it besides having been told it and having been seen. I'm an aerospace engineer, right? So the scientific thing from the DNA did kind of go, okay, cool. I'm glad that my blood is here. Right? To be completely transparent. But so there's various ways. So I'll have Sunshine talk a little bit more about the reconnect meetings and what we do to kind of vet people. Have you done your own history? Go on our website because we have a statement about that reconnection also at karankawas.com.
Yeah, so I would add, obviously the stories may be different from person to person. For why I mentioned our familial lineage is truly because our familial lineage, we don't have mission records. We actually believe that our ancestors were never missionized. Instead, what we ended up doing was when the Spanish came to the coast, we quickly assimilated with their culture, adopted a surname, and just quietly kept it going. What we were able to pass down consistently was our sport, well, specific sports, archery, grappling, running, and then our spirituality. And it's so freaking funny whenever I say that because then people are like, ooh, please do tell. No. I know what happens when I tell y'all, And so outside of that, my mom mentioned, so this was truly for at least my familial lineage, just orally passed down. And my grandma was passed on from her father saying, we're Karankawa. And then when we did the blood test, I was like, oh, thank God. Okay, everything checks out. And so that scenario works for us. If you're here and you're Karankawa, you know what I'm talking about. And if you don't know what I'm talking about, you're probably not Karankawa. And so it's kind of like if you know, you know. If you don't know, you'll never know. But for those people who are Karankawa and they either know they have that heritage or they're not so sure and they're trying to do that work, we ask them to do a few different things if they're agreeable to it. We ask them to explore what doing their DNA looks like. Some people are not agreeable to that. I understand why. We ask them to complete as much as they can their genealogical tree, talk to their elders if they have any elders. If they are able to, in capacity, talk to other Indigenous communities, work within them to see if they can link up families and stories there. If they also just have oral lineage like us, then by continuously joining these online reconnect meetings that we have, there have been cousins that have found each other. Distant cousins, and through those reconnect meetings together, they're able to actually create that oh so sacred bureaucratic paper trail that we are all looking for when it comes to our official claim of indigeneity. But that's what our vetting process is like. And for anybody that it turns out through their journey that, oh wait, shoot, I wasn't Karankawa. That is perfectly fine. We wish them the best of luck. We will always have love for them. We'll always have a sort of community here. But when the truth comes out, as it always does, there's several different ways to go about it.
Besides joining the reconnect meetings, we do those quarterly. We also invite them to come meet people in person, and then we gather once a year. And some of them have come to that as well. And then you mentioned clans. So right now we've got the Hoh'k clan here in Corpus Christi, and then we've got the Coyote clan that is outside Houston, Galveston area. There might be another one maybe starting up, who knows, but you can claim to be Karankawa, and then you are claimed by a clan. And then that's where the forever kind of identity comes, if that makes sense. Yeah. You had a question, Lynn?
Yeah, so just curious, you said most of it's oral history. So I know a lot of times when people are assimilated into cultures, it's like, don't ask, don't tell type of thing. So do you think there's potentially a lot more of the Karankawa people out there that you're unaware of or they're unaware of?
Absolutely. I can say, just looking around the room, most of the people that look this color believe that we're pretty much Hispanic, Tejano, Latino, Chicano, and that's it. Well, that's part of it, right? If you go back another generation or two or three, you'll get to where the indigenous blood is if you're this color, right? It's there. It's just, and that's okay if people don't want to do the work and they don't want to claim indigeneity, that's fine too. Again, we wish them all the best. We welcome everybody who believes that they might be Karankawa to join the meetings, and we tell them at every meeting we start with, we hope this journey leads you to where you resonate at your core, whether it's with us or whatever it is that you find out, that's fine too. Because we truly are a peaceful, welcoming, loving all, we're, basic human dignity. Like if you're, I don't even want to get too far off course, but we love everyone, we accept everyone. There's no phobia where we are in our lives. Life's too short. So we don't need any negativity. We're all about making sure to help people along their journey if we can.
You're not forcing anyone.
Correct.
Yeah.
Correct. We don't force anyone.
I like to jump into historically. Historically, there's this belief that the Spaniards came to Texas. The Spanish came to Texas. When you actually do the research, and I wrote a whole book about this area, Spanish Texas, you find out that not a lot of people want to live in Spanish Texas. The people that want Spanish Texas.
And nobody wanted to live in.
Yeah, there's cattle and corn, but the native people are so strong, it's scary to go into their domain. And so there's people that go to Texas that are labeled as Españoles, as Spaniards, but in actuality, they're almost entirely indigenous. They just have that status and that label as being Spanish. And indigeneity too, that what makes someone Indian, we often look at blood. I think Chiara, you said it best. It's like there's only 3 things.
There are only 3 living entities on this earth that are qualified by the percentage of blood to officially make them whoever they are. Dogs, horses, Native Americans. So I personally absolutely refuse to subscribe to that blood quantum ideology.
Which is why we kind of didn't want to do the flipping DNA thing. But we we talked about it as a family, and, you know, we went ahead just to address some of these questions of how do you know? Well, besides, you know, you being able to feel my spirit and my soul, that was not good enough for a lot of people. And we're like, okay, we'll play the game. It's not gonna change, right? I don't need somebody to tell me who I am. I know who I am, I feel who I am, I breathe who I am, right? Yes, ma'am.
Sorry, when you mentioned dogs, this triggered a thought in my head. Down on the waterfront at the American Bank Center, there is a sculpture that is dedicated to the Karankawa, and it is like the feet, and at the foot, it's like it's cut off below the knees or something, and at the feet there is a dog gazing upward, and it said that they're, of course, mourning the loss of the Karankawa people. But I understand that Karankawa maybe had a strong relationship
Absolutely,
with dogs.
huge affinity. We were great dog lovers, is what a lot of people have said historically. That they, domesticated them.
Oh, okay. So that it's the domestication.
Yeah,
Okay.
so we were able to domesticate so the dogs that we had then, the ancestral times no longer exist now contemporarily. Interestingly enough, they were barkless dogs. There's some people who believe, and I don't know anything about this, but some people believe that they were half fox, half canine. But they were barkless dogs that we were able to domesticate, and they were, by several settler accounts and anthropological accounts, our companions and our hunting partners. And there's a lot of contestment as to how exactly the tribal name Kakwe translates into. One of the many supposed translations is lovers or raisers of dogs.
Oh, very cool. Very cool. Thank you.
Yeah, okay, perfect.
For a little fun fact about the dogs, in the Great Plains area, prior to horses being introduced, they would use dogs and dog sleds to move their goods around. Because the Karankawas are so well connected in the trade networks, it's likely they acquired their dogs from those dog sleds and used them for all sorts of different purposes.
Is there, I think, obviously, it's good stuff that there's a lot more personability to following your history and Karankawa history, but I guess this is also a question for you. Do you find that, like, there is an increasing narrative that needs to be said about Native American people as like a mercantile people?
I think without a doubt. I think when you think of Native peoples of Texas, you get that kind of stereotypical nomadic, aren't connected with other people. When you actually look at the history prior to European colonization of the Americas, there were some incredibly advanced societies. Simply fly into St. Louis. When you fly into St. Louis, you're flying into what was known as Hoh'k, one of the largest settlements, the Mississippian settlements of the era, much larger than London at the time. So these types of settlements were occurring all across the Southwest, the Americas. They just aren't heavily popularized because typically when we teach history, it begins in 1492, not before that. That's a really great question.
Any other questions?
Okay, well, thank you.
Yes.
Oh, no.
I love your question.
So it seems like in like Mesoamerica, there was more, I guess, ability for these Native American empires to kind of come to fruition, and then like have enough time to also fall apart. which is, that's a lot of history that probably goes unsaid. But is there something, the characteristics that we can look at for above Mesoamerica indigenous groups, maybe like the Karankawa, where maybe they weren't able to form empires, but they were able to capitalize on bear fats and raising dogs, but they didn't have the resources to build an empire. Is that something that we could look at?
It depends on the culture. I think empire is a term fraught with problems because it's a European term. But there's this phenomenal book, I'm sure some of y'all are familiar with, called Comanche Empire. It's this historian that's Finnish, Pekka Hamalainen. He makes this argument that the Comanches were so powerful that should be more accurately termed an empire because they acted in all the ways that empires tend to act. They just are composed in a little bit different way. They had like no monarchical leader, but they still enacted tribute, acquired people and goods. And so these types of civilizations are certainly occurring prior to European colonization and after European colonization. When it comes to the Karankawas, though, they were never truly unified as a people up until the 1700s when the Spanish are trying to control their land and they launched these attacks to try to kill all the Karankawa men, take all the Karankawa men, put them into missions, and abduct the Karankawa children and raise them as Spaniards. But in that war, which I read an article about, it's called the Karankawa-Spanish War, the Karankawas proved victorious, and the Spaniards become essentially, in some ways, subservient to the Karankawas. I didn't know where I'm going with this, but I hope that answers.
Sorry, you had a question.
Have you organized any kind of youth groups within your movement?
So we have, so the question was, have we organized any sort of youth groups? We do have a council, a Five Rivers Council, and then as part of the council, we've got a junior council. So we've got some younger folks that also have a vote when we decide things. What we'd like to do is, well, we also are invited to participate in certain celebrations and things like that. And what we often do is do like a children's activity and things like that. So we would like to eventually have more of the youth step up and kind of be ready to take the reins at some point. Yes, sir. Thank you for that question. Yes, sir.
Without getting too personal, that would maybe be uncomfortable, but do you find with your spirituality that you're not just looking to the past, but you're also establishing new traditions from what people are creating together?
Yeah, so I would say that it's both. There's certainly the spiritual practices that have been passed down to us that are very sacred and they should remain that way. But then we also understand the power that it is to belong to a person. So like if I am Karankawa, then now if I was to take this microphone from this room, this would be a Karankawa microphone. So in that way, yes, creating new tradition and new practices is natural. And there's this quote, I'm not sure who said it, but I absolutely subscribe to it, which says, what is now considered ancient and traditional at one point in time had to be new and novel. And so, yes, absolutely, both things have to exist together.
I'll tell you just one tidbit. At our first gathering, a new dance was presented. And that was beautiful. And it didn't have to get taught. Like the person that presented it said it orally, and the rest of us were listening to it, and then we got up and we did the dance, and it was like we had been practicing. It was just beautiful.
Is there any evidence of the Karankawa people being explorers, using watercraft? We're on the water, so there's expectancy of canoes.
There definitely canoes up and down,
And
absolutely.
you would travel other places. So.
There's actually a canoe in San Antonio at the Texas Museum of Cultures.
Which is down that way.
Pardon me?
It's not.
It's not done yet.
Well,
Building this week.
it's being torn down.
But it's still in the building, right?
Yeah.
So the Texas Archaeological Research Lab had a canoe in its possession that was on loan there. Thank you for telling me that it's gone, because I will not make a phone call. Do with the canoe. But we had it recently dated, carbon dated, and it was likely, the vessel that we used, went up and down riverways, waterways.
And there's an interesting series of the Guthrie books talking about the seaports of Texas and how the different waterways, they were navigable waterways, the San Antonio, all these rivers. You go up on the flood, down on the end. So it's, yeah, so that's why I kind of thought that
Yes. Absolutely.
might be right.
Tangible evidence. Yeah.
Historically, we see that being the case as well. We also see a lot of native groups of Texas being incredible long distance runners. We see them in many different instances in the Spanish historical record. The Spaniards will give them messages to send to other people, and they'll offer horses if they run there as quickly as they can. And there's one instance where an individual ran to and back a distance of 50 miles in a single day.
Wow.
And he got a horse for it.
And,
So.
and oh, by the way, the sibling that is now living in Oregon, my child, so her sibling is a state medal runner in Virginia. I'm just saying.
Pass down.
Yeah.
All right, cool. Thank you
Well,
all very
excellent.
much.
Thank you.